January 10th. Welcome everybody that's in the audience here at Carnegie Hall, as well as those of you that are viewing at home. The first order of business is approval of minutes. May I have a motion, please?
I'll move to approve.
Second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Opposed? Okay, motion passed. Okay, reports and updates. First up, engineering design standards and specification updates by Shannon Verhey. Welcome, Shannon. Shannon is our assistant city engineer.
Good afternoon.
Yes.
As Councilor Kyler said, I'm Shannon Verhey from the City Engineer's Office, and I'm here today to give you an overview of our proposed changes that we want to make to our engineering design standards, as well as a change we want to make to Chapter 96 of City Ordinance related to sidewalks. And I have, there'll be I have some people I want to introduce here. One is Lance Weatherly. He's our principal drainage engineer, and he's going to talk about Chapters 11 and 12 with the design standard changes we're proposing there. And then for my part of the presentation, when I talk about accessible sidewalk standards and the ordinances, have Wes Phillips, our principal street engineer, as well as Colleen Moran, our assistant city attorney, to help out with any questions that may come up with that. And one of the first things, why are we here to talk about engineering design standards? By city ordinance, the city council has to approve any changes that we want to make to our engineering design standards. So that's why we're here today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lance Weatherly to go through a few slides on his proposed design standard changes. And I would just propose that after he's done with his presentation, if you have any questions, you can just ask him, and then I can move into my part of the presentation.
Good afternoon, committee members. It's January 10th, and we're here to talk about drainage. It's single-digit temperatures out, but we always take the opportunity to improve our design standards. We did have a record rain event on Christmas Day here not too long ago, and the system functioned fairly well, but we always look to improve, so that's why we're here today. The first one we are proposing is essentially a cleanup item. There were two locations in our design standards that basically had the same information, and they can lead to potential conflicts. So what we were doing in this proposed change to Chapter 11.895-E is basically point to the other location. And what the picture is just for reference. It's talking about a BMP, which is a stormwater treatment device, and the depth of water to treat. So that's what the image in the background is pointing to. Next, in Chapter 11, we are proposing to add some design standard requirements for basically designing for erosion. The picture in the background is a channel near Sertoma and Strabane Trail. Following the August 2015 rain event, there was some erosion that happened there, as evident in the picture. And to help to better clarify for designs moving forward, we are proposing to basically input these standard design requirements for certain types of design for designing channels to be better protected against erosion. That'll do two things. It'll maintain the integrity of that channel and also prevent sediment from going downstream and polluting and improving water quality. The third thing is similar and related to the previous proposed change. It's actually in Chapter 11, our erosion and sediment control, and it relates to basically the size of the rocks we need. Over time, we've noticed that some smaller rocks, the Class A, kind of in that one picture, some of them are an average of 12 inches depth. They are requiring us to do more maintenance, go back and add more rocks. So what we are proposing is designers can use that size of a rock with basically, if it's accepted by the city engineer's office that we reviewed it. Otherwise, we're pushing them toward a larger rock for improving the erosion control of that outlet protection of that pipe. And I guess with that, I'd be open to answer any questions you may have at this time.
Committee members, any questions? Councilor Staley?
So are we talking, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Are we talking about private access ways or public?
These design standards would apply to both public and private.
Well, I see the example that you gave us over by Sertoma there. That was, I'm assuming the city's taking care of that, right?
That is a city drainage way, yes.
So give me an example of a time when a private person would be handling waterways.
Most of these larger ones, if we use on these larger ones, the city generally is dedicated to the city. An example of a private drainage way would be in a development, I guess in a development somewhere a developer doesn't want to they want to keep control over that drainage way. One location out in, I think, Cherry Lake Reserve, there's a few locations out there that they want to maintain those themselves within their HOA. So this design requirement would apply to both public locations and private locations.
So this is really, right now, the city is, the size of rock you can use is being mandated on these things? Or are you saying, moving forward, you're going to mandate yourselves?
It is right now. We are planning to, I guess, improve that design requirement now.
So if we didn't pass this, you couldn't use bigger rocks just without this ordinance being passed?
If this was passed, a designer for both a public or a private channel would need city engineer approval to use that smaller size of a rock.
Okay, thank you.
Councilor Neitzer?
Can you just help me? So like in this drainage way, I assume water is going to be rushing out of these, and then it's going to hit the riprap. Just to dumb it down for us, what exactly is the purpose of the riprap? What is its function? So I can just understand the purpose of the bigger rock.
So its function is that it's a very solid material that will not erode away. So it provides stability. It's kind of like pointing your garden hose right directly at the grass or moving it over and pointing it right at the concrete. If you point it at dirt or grass, it's gonna create turbulence and sediment, and that'll move on. So that's essentially the purpose of placing riprap there, is to provide stability against erosion.
Okay, so it helps to protect against things that I've seen out in the field. I think you might have been out there for one of them where literally the backside of somebody's property is falling down a hill because of the water is making it erode over time.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Councilor Staley?
So this isn't going to be any added cost by requiring bigger rocks? It's just a housekeeping issue?
Bigger rocks tend to cost a small amount more. It's a very small incremental cost, but I mean, if we're talking about a truckload of, a semi-truckload of riprap, we're probably talking on the order of magnitude of $40 to $50 of potential cost.
Okay, thanks.
Just a follow-up question there, is it safe to assume that there could be a savings in the long run? Because if you're replacing riprap that's been washed downstream, now you're just repeating yourself again.
Thanks for bringing that up, Counselor. Yes, there would likely be a benefit as well with potential less maintenance that would be required.
Okay, seeing no further questions on this section, we're ready to proceed to the next. Thank you very much. Good job.
Thank you.
So accessible sidewalks, a little background here. So really everything that we're doing it's just kind of building on the Americans with Disabilities Act that was presented or passed in 1990 at the federal level. So new construction and alterations in the public right-of-way, they must comply with the federal requirements, and the city is responsible for ensuring that federal requirements are met within the right-of-way that we manage. So what we're basically doing here today is we want to make sure that we're staying current with the most current federal requirements out there. And for us, I want to introduce an acronym that you're going to be hearing me say quite often through this presentation, PROAG. Well, what's PROAG? PROAG stands for the Public Rights-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines. And that's the current best practice. And PROAG was developed by the United States Access Board, which is a federal agency. And it's a document that's been adopted by many of the DOTs. It's encouraged for our use by Federal Highway. And then, going to some of the DOTs like the South Dakota DOT, Iowa DOT, Minnesota DOTs, all use this document as the basis of their design when they're designing sidewalks to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. So just some more background. All the changes that we're proposing here today, IRAB approved these at their December 2016 meeting. So it's been vetted by the Infrastructure Review and Advisory Board. And then we also worked with the Home Builders Association on an item I'm going to touch on later regarding sidewalk width. There's some special requirements there that have to be met, and we found a very good solution there working with that group. And we also vetted this through with a group of consulting engineers, designers, both who do public improvements and then also designers who do private improvements, private subdivision work where a private developer would construct the roadways, and then they would dedicate them to the city, and then we would maintain them. So what we're proposing to do, currently we had in Chapter 8, our street design and pavement thickness engineering design standard, we had a really small section on sidewalk design. And what we're proposing to do there is just remove that from the street design section, and we've got enough requirements now for sidewalks. That's going to be its own standalone section. So that's going to be the Chapter 16 that you see in front of you. And then there's also a part of that accessible sidewalk includes protruding objects. Again, those are just more accessible sidewalk requirements as far as making sure we don't have overhangs and whatnot in the right-of-way. And then everything that we did is based on a document called SUDAS. It's the Iowa Statewide Urban Design and Specification Manual. This is a manual that the Iowa DOT, in partnership with a good majority of the communities in Iowa, use this document as their basis of design. And what we did is said, hey, rather than reinvent the wheel, let's use a document that's already been well vetted. So the majority of our document mimics what the SUDAS document is. It's just been kind of tailored to the Sioux Falls specific needs here. And just kind of from an overall standpoint, this PROAG document, this federal document, it's about 112 pages long. What SUDAS and what we've done is we put it in a more friendly, user-friendly document. It's just a little over 20 pages. So try and take federal bureaucracy, consolidate it into something usable. And again, the vast majority, it's just we're formalizing our current standards and practices. We're just putting it into writing, kind of how we've been doing business. There are some new sections I'm going to point out as we move through here, or some things that are a little different than how we've done business. But again, a lot of this goes back to the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, which is, we're talking 10, 20, 25, darn near 30 years ago. When you start talking about landing areas and ramp slopes, those are all requirements that have been around for a long number of years. We're not just making up new regulations for that. Some of the things I am going to talk about, though, that are a little different than how we've been doing business is intersection design, how we're looking at that. Want to talk about dual curb ramps, moving to that instead of single curb ramps. And then talking about the sidewalk width in residential driveways, and then some additional design detail we need. So just an overview of a typical, and a lot of what we're going to talk about is curb ramp design. That's a lot of the, that's a really kind of foundational component of accessible sidewalks, is making sure we have curb ramps that are accessible both for the mobility impaired individual as well as the visually impaired person. So again, up on the screen there, the blue, that's a turning space. You know, that's just basically an area, somebody in a wheelchair, they can come up to an intersection and kind of gather themselves, get to a level spot before they have to navigate that ramp. And then there, the red signifies the ramps. There's certain technical criteria regarding width and slope and cross slope to that. And then you see kind of at the end there, you got the little bumps. Those are detectable warning panels. Those are a visual cue for a visually impaired person. So as they're making their way across they know as they're coming down the sidewalk, they get to that detectable warning panel, they can go, oh, I know I'm entering a street here. So that, you know, these are all the requirements I'm talking about here. Again, those have been in place for 15, 20 years. There's nothing new here. One of the things that ProAg does require, though, that we're moving toward is dual ramp design. So the previous slide as well as this slide, it's showing two curb ramps. One for, it kind of goes in line, it's parallel with the sidewalk direction. So here, the way we've previously had done curb ramp design, they get to that landing area, then they go out into the middle of the intersection, and we want to move toward the dual ramps because it's less movement for the mobility impaired person. They don't have to come to this landing area, go to the middle of the street, and then turn back, kind of get lined up. So that way we're basically going straight across. So in general, we're moving toward dual ramps. There are exceptions where we retrofits where single ramps may be needed, or some of our large intersections, it's just tough to put dual ramps in there. But I'll say foundationally, we're moving toward dual ramps. Another thing is the intersection design. We've always done a good job getting, meeting ADA, getting people up to the street, where we've kind of, the new ProAg requirements put a lot more emphasis on making sure that we're taking our disabled community and factoring them in as they're crossing the street. So now there's some requirements in the, on the slide, the blue shaded areas. We have to make sure that we're meeting certain cross slopes so the street isn't too steep as they're going across it. If it's too steep, you know, just naturally tends to somebody in a wheelchair or something pulls them to one side or the other. So depending on the type of street, there's some different maximums there. In general, our design guidelines, our current street design guidelines comply with this with just a few little tweaks in there. This is one I want to emphasize. One of the requirements of ProAg and the federal requirements out there are we have to have passing zones on the sidewalk if your sidewalk is less than 5 feet wide. So what that means is, you know, two wheelchairs, if they're meeting, the sidewalk has to be wide enough to allow them to pass. So what the federal requirements say is, hey, you can have 4-foot sidewalk, which is what we have on most of our residential streets. You can have that, but when you do that, every 200 feet, you have to have a passing zone. So one of the things we work through with the home builders is, you know, one of the options we considered, should we just make all our sidewalk 5 foot wide? And which would potentially there be an increased cost to that, but then we would be fully compliant everywhere. And I should note, residential sidewalks in general are 4 feet wide. If it's a collector type street, a little more volume, those are 5 foot wide, so they would meet this requirement anyway. The majority of our arterial street sidewalks are 6 foot wide, 5 to 6 foot wide, so they all meet that. So really our discussion point here is on the local residential streets where our sidewalk's 4 foot. So there's kind of 3 options here. Again, one, we could have went to 5 foot sidewalk, which wasn't received very favorably by the Home Builders Association. The other couple options were actually build these passing zones like the illustration shows there. Hey, every 200 feet, just build this, basically widen your sidewalk out to 5 feet for 5 foot in length, and that would meet it. Or else what the standard that we settled on is make your sidewalk through your driveway 5 feet wide. We typically have driveways less than 200 feet, and if you have your sidewalk through that driveway be 5 foot wide, which there's a certain slope that it has to meet, we would be in compliance with this. So that was the direction we moved toward there. From a design detail standpoint, requiring more information. These ramps are complicated to build, regardless how we've been doing business or even going to the dual ramps. There's a lot of technical criteria. It's a lot of work to do an intersection, and kind of the old school of thought, hey, you know what, we're going to design our street, and then we're going to think about the sidewalks after we get the street designed. And that leads to some challenges where maybe your grades don't mesh in there very well. So in working with our designers and people who do this design a lot, you have to think about this design. You have to think about the pedestrian design at the same time you're thinking about the roadway design. And what we've done here is just we're calling out, we need some additional information for the designers to provide. This screenshot up here, it's just a typical plan sheet that we have. I believe this is one of our reconstruction projects. And if you notice kind of the large blow-up circle there, there's a lot of design information that's needed to make sure that we're complying with the federal requirements. And then in Chapter 16, there's also a section on protruding objects here. Should be fairly self-explanatory. The slide on the right there, we shouldn't expect our disabled community, again, mobility impaired, to try and navigate around street signs, fire hydrants. There are actually federal mandated lists as far as clear space, so wheelchairs can get there, as well as think of a visually impaired person. There's certain requirements for where signs hang from or protruding objects, where if they're going along with their cane, they might not be able to see that object that's right at eye level, and they can literally hit that with their face. So it's just identifying some expectations in the right-of-way. The other thing that we're proposing is updates to our updates to Chapter 96, our sidewalk ordinance. And I can kind of summarize that in 3 different areas. First of all, clarify the inspection requirements. Now, to meet our obligation of making sure that the sidewalks installed in the right-of-way meet federal guidelines, we have to make sure that we inspect all the sidewalks that are installed, specifically with new homes. So previously, if a homeowner, when they're building a house, they install the sidewalk on their street frontage. We had not been doing those inspections, so we have to now start doing those inspections so we can make sure that those sidewalks meet the guidelines. In this case, 2% cross slope. That's one of the foundational elements of sidewalk, meaning the slope of the sidewalk, it can't exceed more than 2% cross slope. If it's too steep, that naturally, again, somebody will just, a disabled person can't navigate that very well. And that, again, that's a foundational element of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So we're just going out there making sure that they comply with it. And it's a fairly strict standard, but it's something that we have to enforce. The other thing is clarified permit requirements. The way the existing ordinance is written, it basically says anybody doing sidewalk or driveways in the public right-of-way has to get a sidewalk or driveway permit from the city engineer's office. Well, we have the vast majority of our sidewalks and driveways in the city are installed as part of a building permit. And that really wasn't clarified there. So what we've done is said, hey, if you pull a building permit, you don't have to get an engineering sidewalk and driveway permit. That's included as part of the building permit. It's just more or less clarification of how we've been doing business. And then we arranged it for better flow. The flow of just the permits, the who's in charge, the specifications, where we're just going to just move the sections for better flow there. So with that, love to entertain any questions.
Okay, great. Thank you, Shannon. Questions? Councilor Neitzer.
This is good information. I did also go to the IRAB website and downloaded their plate numbers. Yep. Some of these plate numbers and stuff. Yep. So some of my questions might reference, I won't say the plate number or whatever, but so first of all, so if I get a permit to replace a sidewalk, not as part of a building permit, just on my own through your office. What is the fee associated with that, and is that changing as part of this?
We're not changing the fee. Wes? 15? Believe it's $15, but I'd like to clarify that.
Okay. And then the 5-foot segment, was that every 200 feet? Is that what it was? It has to be a minimum of every 200 feet on the length of a sidewalk?
Yeah, to meet the requirement, but the approach we're taking is for standardization, every driveway will be that 5-foot wide sidewalk through there.
Okay, and so if I understand, as I'm walking down the street or the sidewalk, and the sidewalk would be 1 foot wider, the panel would be 1 foot wider going towards the house, so my driveway actually shortens by a foot, assuming there's enough right-of-way there to do that, right?
Exactly. Typically, the right-of-way is 2 foot behind the sidewalk in a typical residential subdivision. If you want to say the driveway's shorter on the house side, the volume or the area of concrete doesn't change, but you could say the slope. A lot of times your driveway slope is sloped up to the garage. That slope would start 1 foot farther, closer to the house.
Would I see the sidewalk panel actually move up a foot? Do you know what I'm trying to say? Would the sidewalk panel would my driveway panel end?
The sidewalk panel would visibly be 5 foot wide through there.
Yeah, okay.
Because if they actually just start sloping that up, you're not going to meet the 2% cross slope requirement.
Sure. And so if I'm in an existing subdivision like mine is, and I have 4-foot sidewalks presumably on my street, a local street, and I have a panel that needs to be replaced, and I go in and I want to get a permit, are you going to make me put in a 5-foot panel because there's none existing in this existing subdivision, or we have to retrofit? How does that work?
We'll have to work through those on a case-by-case basis. I mean, we're not going to, there's provisions in the federal requirements and our proposed that if there's technical infeasibilities, structural, if you're coming in to replace one panel, you'd have to comply with the requirements, but like the width shouldn't be an issue. If they have 4-foot sidewalk now, you can put a 4-foot wide sidewalk back.
Yeah, what I'm getting at is I have all 4 foot, so we don't meet the 5-foot requirement that you have. I'm one guy who my panel goes bad. And I have 2 feet, I believe, to my property line. So I have 2 feet of grass, as you're kind of implying. Would you make me put in that 5-foot panel to start to set the table to fix, essentially to bring this whole length up to code? That's what I'm getting at.
That's a fair question. And I think that's, I'd like to do a little research and get you a good answer on that, rather than guess on that. Wes, do you have any? In
general, if you're...
Hey, Wes, you want to...
Good question.
My name is Wes Phillips. I'm the principal street engineer for the city. I guess the way I would answer is, in general, if you were coming in to replace all of your sidewalk on your property, that would be the time where some of those, the 5-foot passing zone would be, we try to accomplish that at that time. But for a small sidewalk repair, it might not be the right time to address that.
Okay, and my last question before I defer, because I have more, is let's take another example. I'm replacing my driveway now. I need to replace my driveway. I'll go get a permit. Then I have to make that driveway shorter and take out the sidewalk panels and bring mine up to the 5-foot standard?
No, there's multiple ways of doing that, and especially in a retrofit situation, because of how the grades work out, if we said you had to make it 5 foot wide there, you might have to replace your driveway all the way up to the garage because you're chasing grade up there. There's other ways to accomplish that, and we've actually already talked through internally what would happen if a contractor forgets to make their driveway 5 foot wide. Well, we're not in the business of making people rip out $3,000–4,000 worth of concrete. They can maybe just go back And actually, I'll show you here. What we're showing up here actually meets the requirement. So if they wanted to come back and to rectify their wrong installation on a new installation, hey, just go back and replace one panel 5 foot wide. Maybe do it right next to your driveway. That might be a couple $100 in lieu of several $1,000s.
Yeah, so what I was getting, my whole driveway shot, let's say, my
Yep.
3-car garage, the whole thing's got to come out.
Yep.
So what I'm saying is at the point, would you then make them do the 5
Yeah,
foot deal again?
like Wes is saying, if you're redoing your whole site, then, yeah, if you're redoing your whole driveway, then we would expect you to comply with the design standards. If it's one panel, 2 panels, no, you're not going to have to go above and beyond.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Just point of clarification there, if I may, Councilor Staley. Let's say the sidewalk portion of the driveway is in good shape. Does that have to be torn out as well?
If the site,
If the rest of the driveway is what's broken up and in a state of disrepair, but the sidewalk portion of the driveway is in good condition?
I don't know if I'm quite following you, but we would have no, I would say no jurisdiction over the private property driveway as far as from a public works standpoint. I mean, if they're replacing their driveway on private property, they don't need a permit from engineering. I can't speak for planning and zoning on that, but
Councilor Neitzer, I think you're following my line of questioning.
Yeah, I am. And maybe we need to be clear. So, like in my case, from the garage down to the sidewalk, obviously I have 3 big panels. It's my driveway. I have the sidewalk going across, and then I have the apron. So I guess I was talking about the case where maybe I go from the sidewalk closer to my garage all the way up to my garage. I'm replacing that. I'm not touching the apron. Maybe it depends whether I'm taking everything down to the whole apron and the curb and gutter versus just down to the sidewalk. Is that fair?
Yep. I guess for the example of just replacing the driveway on your property, you wouldn't be required to get into the sidewalk, so you wouldn't be required to do anything with the sidewalk. If you're replacing everything from the driveway to the street, then at that point, you can easily make that requirement the 5 foot transition because you're already replacing everything. So that's the point where we would, I guess, incorporate that requirement.
Sure. Once you encroach on the right of way.
Right, and I think that clarifies our questions earlier as well, too. Thanks for that.
You bet.
Now, Councilor Staley.
Well, and for the record, let me say, the last thing that I want to be a part of is to create a hardship for just the average homeowner. I think any of these exemptions we're talking about here, they need to be very clearly documented in this ordinance. So we're not having some gray area and allowing for somebody to be put in a really difficult position. But I've got a few questions. The first is, several years ago, I did have the dual runway, so to speak, put on my corner lot. And I understood at that time the federal government was paying for that. Did we have some federal funds coming in ever for?
I would guess that would have been part of a mill and overlay project. Did we do the street? as a part
The
of
street
that?
was done, yes.
No, those would have been city funds. I don't know that we've
Okay.
ever had
All right.
federal funds on those.
So that was done, and then is our plan in the city to make that happen to every single intersection in every neighborhood?
Based on the Americans with Disabilities Act, we're required to do that as we have it in our transition plan and as we do street projects to improve our streets.
Okay, so help me to see if I have this right, that most of the things you're asking for right now would be relating to new construction, right? Except, we're talking about the sidewalk area over here, but as far as like the protruding objects, is that going to be something that you're going to address within existing sidewalk areas?
if you're asking, are we going to go and start policing sidewalks for protruding objects?
Yes.
No active program like that. Again, the engineering design standards as a whole are intended for new construction. In the rehab type situations, yeah, there is some gray area in there. We have to work with that all the time. And, you know, a good example is the 6th Street Hill, the cobblestone hill up there, when that was rebuilt. That probably doesn't meet current design standards. So we have to use our engineering judgment when we do a project like that and do stuff accordingly. Again, fundamentally, this is for new construction to make sure that we're complying with the federal requirements. You know, and maybe a point of clarification, you asked, are we going to do this on every intersection?
Yes,
Do you mean dual ramps or just?
yes, yes.
In general, I wouldn't say we're going to do dual ramps on every corner, because if we have a single ramp right now that complies with all the slopes, we're not obligated by these standards or the federal standards to go back and put 2 ramps in. And that would be an awful lot of money to go back and retrofit all those. So again, new construction, yes, dual ramps. Again, if a existing corner doesn't meet the requirements, if the landing slopes aren't right, if the ramp slopes aren't right, if we don't have the width, or if we don't have the detectable warning panel, yes, we have to bring those into compliance.
So if just moving forward, if there'd be something that would state, you know, what about an individual replacing 1 square or 2 squares of a sidewalk, that they are not going to have that 5-foot mandate, can we have that maybe stated? So that some little old lady doesn't get caught replacing a sidewalk and then a little, you know, because you sometimes go out and mark if there's a sidewalk that's cracking up, and I just would hate to have them put in 5 feet on 1 square or 2 squares.
Yeah, that's a good question. And we could certainly go back and consider that. Generally with again, the design standards are intended for new construction. We have to work through the unique situations all the time. I guess that would be we'd use the engineering judgment that we typically use.
So it would say, if it's going to say new construction in the ordinance, then?
I believe it. I need to look at how it's exactly written. I think we're probably covered, but I'd like to follow up on that a little bit more.
Councillor Selber.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. I'm learning a lot here. Now, these sidewalk standards, they're set federally, is that correct? They're standards?
Good afternoon. I'm Colleen Moran, one of the assistant city attorneys.
Hello.
And there are federal standards. And when Shannon talked about PROWAG, developed by the U.S. Access Board, the U.S. Access Board is a federal agency that says this is required under the American with Disabilities Act, and this is how we think it's best implemented. And so they will, you know, the width of a sidewalk is a standard that needs to be followed. The curb ramp and the slope are standards that need to be followed, and everybody in the United States is supposed to follow those standards.
Okay. Yeah, I was just clarifying if it all kind of stemmed from the Americans with Disabilities Act. So on top of the city inspecting to make sure everything complies, does the federal government send people through from time to time to look at areas such as sidewalks to make sure they comply?
Yes, that happens, and especially if somebody has filed a complaint, and that is the result. If they file a complaint with the federal agency, the federal government may come in and look at it. There are other communities in which the federal government, without a complaint, has come in and looked to make sure that we're in compliance as well.
Okay. Yeah, I would imagine if it gets to that level and we haven't been holding up our end of the bargain, that's not good.
That's not good.
That's not good. Okay, and 2 quick questions here. When I'm looking at the curb ramps here, I'm curious because I probably walked over these a bunch and now I'm paying a little more attention. Like on the curb ramps down, that material with the knobby substance on the ramps, what is that made of and what's the life expectancy? Are those replaceable from time to time, or will they last as long as the rest of the sidewalk?
So there's a couple answers. So basically, most of them that you see out there are made of a composite, basically a plastic type material. And the original ones weren't replaceable, but the ones we've moved to in the last few years are made to be replaceable. so you can just unscrew them and put a new one in.
Okay.
Now, with that said, we are moving toward the design standards don't specifically say this, but on projects that we build, which is typically the arterial type street projects that receive a lot more intense snow removal. You know, they're running the blades up on the sidewalk, they're pulling the snow back. We're going to move toward cast iron detectable warning plates, which have a lot more, well, essentially they're indestructible. Where the composite ones, if you catch them with the edge of a blade, you're gonna break them. You know, one of the drawbacks with them is they're cast iron, so they tend to rust a little bit and they bleed a little bit. We do have installations of those 26th Street, West 26th Street from about Marion Road to, I believe it's Valley View or maybe even Sertoma. That has cast iron plates on it. So again, we're gonna be moving toward that on our arterial projects and some of our downtown type projects where the snow removal is really intense. As far as life expectancy of the composite ones, I really don't know, you know, as far, you know, but they do have special, you know, they're treated for UV and stuff like that, but they're, you would have to expect that after a certain couple of decades, they might not be replaced.
One final one along those lines, if I might. That turning space that we see, is that just a cement slab like their other concrete slabs, or is that a different material? Like
Nope, it's concrete.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Councilor Neitzer.
Just a few more round two. So the federal rules, when do they expect these to be triggered? Is it on new construction? Is it on certain rehabs? Is it complaint basis? Do they expect us to go through the city and get it all fixed? What is the trigger point that they require it?
So actually, I'd actually answer two questions with your original question. I think I might go back to something that Councilor Staley was asking. Can you go to page 16.5 of the proposed design standards?
The chapter 16?
Yep, chapter 16, page 16.5. I'm having Lance pull it up here too for the screen. But basically 16.5 talks about applicability. So there's new construction and there's alterations. So new construction, basically we're saying within the scope of the project shall be made acceptable except when it's demonstrated that it's structurally impractical. Structurally impractical means you got a huge hill or something like that. You can't meet certain grades. Alterations, and that's where I think Councilor Staley's, we would address it there, is when alterations are made to the pedestrian circulation path, which is kind of a fancy name for the sidewalk, it shall be made accessible to the maximum extent feasible within the scope of the project. Again, you're replacing one panel. The scope of the project isn't to replace your entire driveway. It isn't intended to replace all your sidewalk frontage. You know, if that homeowner is just replacing two panels, we need to make those two panels as accessible, that's as feasible as possible. So now as far as alterations for us, an alteration, if we, for instance, if we do an overlay in an area, we need to make sure the curb ramps are compliant. That would be considered an alteration, and there's some federal requirements there. If we reconstruct a project, we have to make sure that whole project is accessible. Now, if we're just doing if we're in a park situation and we're just replacing 100 feet of sidewalk, that doesn't trigger the whole park to be made accessible. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I'll read this over offline. A couple other things. You know, like if you do the 5 foot, I could see it's something that people will have to think about and will have to be aware of. I assume if the whole point of the sidewalk being 5 feet wide is so you know, two wheelchairs can pass, and if that's in a driveway, that means people need to be cognizant of the length of their vehicles. because, and they have to now, they're not supposed to be encroaching on the sidewalk, and now it might move up a little bit, so one would have to be a little careful.
Okay.
You know, you can't just follow just sort of kind of the end of the grass, as it were. Subdivisions with no sidewalk there are places in town that don't have any sidewalk, or is that something that it's just waiting for somebody to make an ADA complaint and then we'd have to put sidewalk in it, or?
I'll have Wes answer that.
I guess in general, where you have sidewalk, it's required to be put in accessible for all. Where there isn't sidewalk, you know, there aren't necessarily ADA requirements to have sidewalk, but we do have a process that you've all been involved in where if we get complaints that there's no sidewalk, we bring that to the city council then to a hearing to determine if sidewalk should or should not be required. So that's kind of an independent issue. It's related, but kind of a little bit independent of what we're talking about today.
Okay. And my last question has to do about obstructions, existing obstructions on the sidewalk. And I'll give you an example. And I don't remember what the measurements were, but when I was first elected to the council, somebody called me and had concerns about some obstructions on Benson Road. When you walk, it was on the south side of Benson Road when you're walking between Cliff Avenue to I-229. There are existing light poles and other things, and the sidewalk didn't kind of go around it. It just kind of went through it. And so I don't remember. You'd have to take a tape measure out. What about those areas where you might have, let's say, a light pole and maybe it's only 48 inches, you know, from it? Do those have to go back and be rectified, or?
In general, the primary goal will be to get that out of the sidewalk. However, that's not always feasible. So then within the ADA, there's also minimums of, minimum sidewalk width that you need around an obstruction. And generally that's 4 feet, according to the ProWAG requirements. And that specific case, I was involved in that a little bit, and we do meet the minimums at that point. The previous minimums were actually 36 inches around an object, and I believe we meet both of those requirements out on Benson.
Yeah, you may. I think it was close. It might have been 4 feet at worst or something. But in new constructions, would there be an endeavor to try not to have any encroachment on the sidewalk, not have a light pole just sitting, even if there is 4 feet, to make sure that sidewalk either jogs around or you push the light back? Or
Yep. In general, the best thing would be to either relocate the sidewalk or relocate the obstruction. But it's just not always possible, depending on the right-of-way availability and other obstructions, and there's a lot of requirements to try to juggle.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, committee, thank you very much. Good questions, and thank you, Shannon, and Lance, and Wes, and Colleen, too. Colleen, you were able to get in on the act a little bit. Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to now move on to our next topic, which is annexation program. And we've asked Director Cooper to kind of give us a little bit of a history of the annexation, where we're at and where we're possibly going. And the process, this one has generated some interest. And so the process will be staff will present. And then, as we just did, we will have committee members have the option of asking questions. And then I'm going to, because we have other council members that have stayed with us here this afternoon, and thank you for your presence. We're going to make it, if they have any questions or input that they would like to add, we will do that. We will not take public input at this point in time, but any public members that are here, we appreciate your presence this afternoon. And I'm not sure where this particular topic is going from here, but if it were to stay in land use, there would be an appropriate time that we would take public input. Right now, we're in the initial stages. We're simply here trying to get a history lesson. So, Director Cooper.
Thank you.
begin.
Good afternoon, members of the Land Use Committee. I'm Mike Cooper. Joining me today, Albert Schmidt with the Planning and Building Services Department. We wanted today to give you an abbreviated version of a presentation that we did back in November to the full council talking about our annexation program. And the intent today is to begin the discussion with the committee and see where we go forward of trying to maybe reset where we're at with our annexation strategy and work with the council on maybe better defining how annexations should go forward. And then I'll kind of talk about some ideas that maybe we can begin with today. So the intent today is to really begin and not make any final decisions. So the annexation history of Sioux Falls obviously goes back to the founding of our city. As property is annexed into the city, that determines where our future services are going to be expanded, whether they're going to be water, sewer, street improvements, neighborhood parks, fire stations, branch libraries, and so on. And through the decades, the city limits have continued to expand. Now we're at about 78 square miles, and we're expecting that we'll have even more voluntary annexations in 2017. But when you look at this particular map, it would appear that up until the 2000s, everything was perfectly squared off and all those gaps were filled with the annexation. And that's somewhat true, but what we've found in more recent years is that as these city limits have expanded, the parcels that have been annexed are much smaller than they have been historically. And I think that's been driven by the cost of development, the type of development. We're not seeing these large parcels brought in by developers at one time like we did back in earlier decades. So we've had annexation programs in place for some time, and back in 2014, we began talking about a more aggressive way of defining how annexations should be led by the city, where there is not necessarily voluntary action by the property owners. So just in general, obviously the annexation is a way of expanding our municipal boundaries. City planning, along with engineering and other departments, review all types of annexations before they're brought to the city council, and that's governed by not only local ordinances but also by South Dakota law. Typically, there's one major way that property has been annexed, and that's by voluntary petitions. 75% of the valuation of the property and of the registered voters, that has to be signatures on that annexation petition. And then those are reviewed by staff with a recommendation to come to the city council. And typically we look at if it's in a service area, if in a reasonable amount of time, we can provide what types of utilities or other infrastructure is going to be required for development of that property. There's also a process where the city can initiate annexations. And as you are aware, we started one of those and we've pulled back on that again to try to reset where these future annexation processes should be going. We've also brought a few pre-annexation agreements to the council, which is kind of that intermediate step that can present a timeline with some future conditions that would trigger annexation by the property owners, to give both the city and the property owners maybe a better idea of when those annexation timelines are going to be implemented and what financial impact that would have to both the city and the property owners. So the purpose of annexations is pretty basic: a better coordination of services and improvements, greater awareness of the timing and expectations for those improvements, not only by the property owner, but also by the city. A big part of our capital improvement program is deciding where and when and how to invest in infrastructure improvements. And so if we're expecting some future annexations, or if we're going to be initiating some annexations, that's an important aspect for us to know to help prioritize where those future investments should go. And then just in general, a more equitable distribution of infrastructure and service costs, where you have property that's adjoining unannexed property, where there's been street improvements made or utility improvements made, or maybe there's access to a neighborhood park or a fire station. Everybody helps pay for those types of future improvements when they're in the city of Sioux Falls. So we have a lot of different scenarios, and this is one that is probably fairly common in recent years, that we'll get a voluntary petition to annex a parcel of land, and it meets all of the requirements. It's within our service area. We know that we can provide utilities and other infrastructure within a reasonable amount of time. We put together a future land use plan that fits our comprehensive plan. And when the annexation comes to us, we end up creating a couple of pockets, because there are other properties in between the current city limits and the petitioned property that are maybe not ready for various reasons to be annexed. It could be vacant land. It could be land that has houses on it, or it could even be land that has a business on it. So this is a very common way that we have seen in recent years that these different pockets have been created in. We've identified over 60 areas within and adjacent to the city limits that we've identified could potentially be candidates for future voluntary or city-initiated annexations. So what are the implications of having unannexed land within our city limits or adjacent to the city limits? A very common impact is that when we're doing an arterial street improvement and there's unannexed land adjacent to that street improvement, we typically have to work around those property owners. And in some cases, we may not be able to get additional right-of-way. We would not include sidewalk, or we would have to delay sidewalk assessments. There's all kinds of different scenarios that we've run into in the past, as well as for utility improvements. So without knowing if and when that property is going to be annexed, it could change the driveway locations. It could change where the utility services are going to go. So that's a very common issue that we run into. Severe end would be that potential development projects could potentially be stalled due to areas of unannexed property. And that could be not only a city project, but it also could be another developer. Maybe a developer wants to bring in property, but there's unannexed land in between that property and the current city limits. We haven't run into that as much recently, but it's certainly a scenario that could happen. The third one is that municipal ordinances, codes, only obviously apply to land that's annexed into the city. So again, you have land that's not in the corporate limits next to land that is. We would not be able to regulate the burning of trash, watering restrictions, animal control, nuisance trees, the sidewalk, if there is a sidewalk, discharging of weapons. There's a longer list than this that we could put together of potential issues. So the city staff is very, very interested in continuing with some type of an annexation process. But we understand that with the council, with the citizens of Sioux Falls, that we need to better define what that annexation process is going to be. I'm talking more specific about the three different types, whether it's voluntary, city-initiated, or pre-annexation. So one of our requests going forward from tonight is the city council, in whatever manner is going to be appropriate, to help prioritize maybe projects or properties that we should be targeting for the different types of annexation. And then once we've identified what those priorities should be, or identified, better define those, how can we implement that process of looking at these pockets of unannexed land within the city limits? We also would like to continue to look at ways that we can incorporate policies for development around the city limits. Well, we work really closely now with Lincoln and Minnehaha counties on different kinds of planning and zoning issues. But are there things that we can look at to even improve on ways to maybe prevent some of these pockets or issues going forward? And one of the things that we mentioned last time was that if there's a rural residential property owner next to the city limits and their septic system is failing, should we be able to work with them to either look at ways that we can connect them to the city sewer, or at least if they are going to replace their septic system, how is that going to potentially trigger future annexation and future use of a connection to city water and sewer? So there's a lot of things that we can continue to work on, not only within the current city limits, but also in those areas around both Lincoln and Minnehaha counties. And then another one is, how can we better communicate with unannexed landowners on the potential timing of future services and improvements? We have been proactively going out the last 2 to 3 years and meeting with different development areas, different property owners about potential annexation and trying to give them a better understanding of what the financial impacts might be if they do come into the city limits. And we've been spending the last 2 years on one of the major rural subdivisions, which is the Prairie Meadows development on West 41st Street. We've spent a huge amount of time looking at different ways that we could work with that rural subdivision to bring them into the city. And there's others that we have been talking to as well. But again, we have a list of about 60 potential candidates that are either within the current, surrounded by current city limits, or that are adjacent to that. Again, today we're not expecting a final decision by the City Council or the Land Use Committee, but we've just started talking about some ideas for future discussion on prioritizing these annexation areas. So one would obviously be if the unannexed property is adjacent to a planned street or utility improvement. Should the city be more proactive in working with that property owner or owners on a timeline to get them into the city in conjunction with those improvements? Another scenario, if the unannexed property is completely surrounded by land that's annexed and actually is fully developed. We have a lot of these pockets that are surrounded by the city limits, but they're in various stages of development around them. So maybe the highest priority would be once we're fully developed around those pockets, that would trigger more discussions with those properties. Another priority might be if the unannexed property is completely surrounded by undeveloped land, but it's still in the city limits. Maybe that would be a lower priority. So this is just the beginning of some ideas that we put down for future discussion with the City Council. But what we want to get back from you, whether it's the Land Use Committee or the full council eventually, is what type of annexation process is the City Council willing to support? Do you want us to go forward with only voluntarily petitioned annexations? Do you want us to look at scenarios where the city would be working with property owners on city-initiated annexations? And are the pre-annexation agreements something that you think are worthwhile that we could continue to work on? And if we do decide that we're going to go forward with city-initiated annexations, another huge question for the council and for the city staff is what level of improvements would be required. Let's go back to the Prairie Meadows example. You have rural residential gravel streets, large lots, septic systems maybe in some cases, although out there's going to be a sanitary sewer system. But we have scenarios where these existing rural subdivisions they're all septics, there may be rural water, they may have wells, and they have gravel streets. So when they come into the city, whether voluntarily or by city initiation, what level of improvements should we be working with them on, and how would those improvements be implemented going forward? You know, you can think back of the Norton and Froelich additions, Hayward. Those were all annexed, but they were not required to bring their property up to city standards. The Old Orchard is another one. So going forward, what should the policy be as we continue to address these pockets? But I can tell you that as the city limits continues to expand, even with the voluntary petitions that we're going to see, these pockets are not going to go away. We're going to continue to see more and more of them, and that's why we feel it's important to have some type of a process, some type of a policy that we can work together on to help come up with the best way to deal with those in the future. And there's going to be all kinds of scenarios. It could be one individual vacant lot, it could be one individual residential owner, or it could be a subdivision. So everything in between is what we're facing. So I think that's it for today, and I'll be happy to answer any questions or hear other comments that you might have.
Okay, great. Well, ready, set, go. Councilor Neitzer.
Thank you very much. I hope this is the start of a dialogue both ways. To me, as I've studied this, there seems to be, and specifically talking about the city-initiated annexation, there's really, from what I can find, really kind of three prongs. There's the public good balanced against the cost and the due process. And when it comes to public good, I was just reading a Supreme Court decision in South Dakota, and I think they were quoting another Supreme Court. The people and property owners of an area proposed for annexation have neither the moral nor legal right to stand aloof from the incorporated community of which they are a de facto part, enjoying most of the benefits, but disclaiming their duty to participate in providing these essential services. The kicker for me is when are they a de facto part? That's the tough part. When do they become really part of the community? As you talked about, is it when they're totally surrounded? Is it just developed? Is it annexed? That is also balanced by, as I read some of those cases, they're very sensitive to the due process, that this is a very serious business, annexing somebody forcibly, and specifically because of very large cost. So I think it's important to figure out that we have a lot of, we have a good paper trail that shows that there was a good faith effort to have those discussions, and that maybe we declare an impasse, as it were, you know, and then maybe we start. I don't think it's probably realistic to say never, because obviously there's going to be a lot of people that are just, I don't want to pay, and they'll just stay out forever. But I do see, you know, if you're completely surrounded by city limits, I mean, I can go to some pockets where they must be essentially benefiting from most services. I mean, you know, roads and sidewalks and things like that, and they're quote unquote standing aloof. So I think it's a good conversation. Has there been, so one question, you are required, I believe, by city code to connect to the city sewer within 5 years of annexation, I believe. Does that sound right?
Of notification, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So what would be the harm in saying, okay, in a case where you've maybe replaced your septic tank 2 years ago, saying you can use it out its useful life, but of course I don't believe you could permit a septic tank in the city of Sioux Falls. Once it's reached its useful life, you're going to have to connect to the sanitary sewer. But if, you know, maybe it has years ahead of it, rather than making somebody tear out or discontinue a perfectly good one.
We've actually had that within some of our pre-annexation agreements that allow that to happen in the future. So yeah, I think that's an option that can certainly be looked at. Because as you say, one of the big issues with not so much vacant land, because that vacant land is most likely going to change in use at some future point. But the existing development land, particularly the people that have built a home on large lots that want to stay, the financial impact to them is what has been a significant part of our discussions in the past, where people say, well, what's the benefit to us to being in the city if they're going to be incurring all these additional assessment costs on us?
And that's the thing that it keeps coming back to when I talk to people outside that are looking at being annexed. They can't get past that cost, that number, and it's really, if we could figure out how to get past that, but I'm not sure exactly how. You know, if we should talk about cost share or you know, but then I start thinking about, you know, is there costs that I incurred when I, you know, bought a home in the city of Sioux Falls that they're paying on the back end, essentially what I paid on the front end? And then do we set precedents if, you know, then maybe I could say, well, you know, I'm just going to build my house first and not annex, because then the city will pay to do the improvements later. Whereas if I annex the land and do bare ground and then build, then the developer has to pay for it. So
one of the aspects that we mentioned last time is that if you have an acre or a 2-acre lot, which is very typical for these rural subdivisions, compared to what a typical city lot is with that amount of frontage, there's a large difference in what the cost would be to put in those improvements.
okay, fair enough. I'll defer and let others.
Councilor Selberg.
Thank you. Any idea, is there an estimate how many of these pockets exist?
Well, we have a map that shows over 60 of different types of pockets. Some of them are completely surrounded. Some of them are adjacent to the existing city limits. So we can provide that information to you, but in terms of, whoops, I just lost, oh, okay. This is the list of annexation areas that we put together by name and by location. And as you can see, some of those are completely surrounded by city limits and some of those are more on the edge.
Would you say a number of them are residences, or just a few, or just hard to say? I'm trying to get an idea.
I would say over half of them are existing residential development areas.
Okay, and it sounds like, you know, when in the one section here, it's almost like you've got your own lawless island on some of these. I mean, you say everything from snow removal is hard to enforce, discharging of weapons. Has there actually been a lot of issues with that, where somebody might be breaking an ordinance and we can't do anything about it?
It hasn't been a large issue for us recently, but I'm just saying that it, you know, potentially could be, particularly when the development is surrounding somebody that's not in the city. You know, you don't want to have those kind of complaints coming to us. So, but Albert, I don't know that we have it, the metric of how many of these are residential versus non-residential, but a large number of these are existing residential development.
Okay, thank you.
On those large lots.
If I could just have a quick follow-up, since we're on that topic. One of the implications of having unaccessed land, annexed land rather, burning trash and fire farms, watering restrictions. Now, if they are hooked up to city water, would they be required to follow the watering restrictions if they're unannexed but they're hooked up to city water?
I don't believe they would be, but their water bill would be pretty high, which they have to pay.
I see. Okay. Yeah, based on the flow rate.
Yep,
Yeah.
based on the meter.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Councilor Neitzer.
For what it's worth, there are sometimes conflicts on, for example, on West 12th Street, the Rocky Ridge subdivision. There's some areas right along 12th Street that are not annexed, and it's not a huge deal, but they might complain about burning trash or some things that go on in those properties that are not annexed yet, because of course it's in the county and they're allowed to do that, you know. So there's a couple examples I do see where we've done, I guess, what I would call flagpole annexation. You know, like maybe I'm wrong, but you know, like the George McGovern School and Foundation Park. Does that set us up for problems later, or would you dispute my characterization?
I would say that those were done in accordance with the procedures, yes. McGovern Middle School, we struggled for years to find a location for that school. We only found one property owner that was willing to work with us. All the other surrounding property owners said no way. we had to have a school site available and open by a certain date. With Foundation Park, we did work with McCrossen's Boys Ranch, and we expect that at some future date will continue to be added to the city limits over a period of time.
Okay, and to be clear, I was not implying that anything was improper. I'm just talking about the shape of it. I mean, you can do a short strip of land to make that annexation contiguous, so there's no implication that anybody did anything that was improper. But I was just curious, if you do those, you kind of maybe you start creating more pockets again, rather than doing contiguous.
But I'll go back to that other example that I showed you, that when a petition comes in for voluntary annexation and there's existing property owners that are not ready to be annexed yet, that's a big way that we see these pockets have evolved over the years.
Okay. I know interest rate is set in ordinance, but something else that's come up as a discussion point is maybe in this particular case there should be, because I hear from people who have $150,000 and $200,000 homes that are looking at $60,000 assessments. I mean, just throwing out round numbers. That's huge. You know, I mean, maybe there should be 0% interest in certain cases, because it seems like of course, we're going to lose a little bit of money on that, but it would seem that us as a city, it's going to hurt a lot less on our side than it is on. I mean, that could put somebody out of a home, I would think.
The city council did approve an ordinance amendment that allows us to extend the annexation, allows the city council to extend the assessment process out longer, but there's still an interest rate to that.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Can I just? I'm sorry. I want to move on.
Councilor Staley,
Sorry.
and then we can come back. Councilor Neitzer. Yep.
Well, first of all, I want to make a statement that I think we have to be very careful about not making these property owners into bad guys. And I know the statement has been made that they're not contributing to our society, but many of these people work in Sioux Falls, they're paying sales tax, and that's a big chunk of what we use to keep our city going. So in essence, they're contributing to something that they're not getting a benefit from if we're talking about just general sales tax, capital improvements and such. But I think we have to be careful that we're not going to be pushing people out of their homes by putting a financial hardship on them. I was concerned early on, and I don't think you were here, Albert was here when we were talking about the Metzger property, but I was so grateful that Councilor Neisert and I got to go to that Prairie Meadows meeting last spring, because we heard these people talking. I saw you and Director Cotter there talking with these people. I got the sense there had been a lot of give and take, a lot of dialogue happening. And I think that's one of the big things. The due process element for me is huge. And I don't think that was what was alarming with this Metzger property, because it seemed to come out of nowhere. And he was not, for good or bad, he wasn't notified. So we need to make sure that we're letting the citizens understand that this is coming up. We have to find a better way of informing them of that. But back to what Councilor Neisert said about the interest rate. Our city's talking about getting great interest rates on the money that we're borrowing, 1.5%. I don't think that it's fair to turn around and charge a homeowner 3% on this forced annexation infrastructure that we're going to be doing. So I would say let's find a way of making that very affordable for them. We shouldn't be making money on the backs of these people, in my opinion. And someone even mentioned, why not look at having some second penny money, maybe do a split 50-50 on this thing. That would make it more palatable to any of these people. Just throwing that out. And then another thing, I guess I'm not aware of the pockets, and you need to educate us to know if there's a residential area that is totally surrounding a residence that's not annexed. That's different than having a whole area outside of town that hasn't been developed yet. I want to ask a question about the area east of Highway 11. That whole, what's that area called over there?
Split Rock Heights.
Yeah, are we going to be annexing them sometime?
It's on our map. We haven't put a timeline together yet.
Okay, so that's going to be interesting. We start rolling towards them, and if we approach them the same way we did the Metzger property, I think we would be hearing lots of pushback on that. So I don't know that one size is going to fit all on this thing. when we
But
move
it's a
forward.
significant issue, as you are saying and as we're talking today. So that's why we want to have an annexation process. We think that's very important. And so what that looks like is all of us working together to maybe better define, as I started out saying today, and taking all these ideas and moving forward with them.
Councilor Neitzer, you had more?
Yeah, just to maybe finish up, I think it is a good thing that you did bring up that we should be talking about minimum improvements required, because I'm not sure when you do annex, I'm not sure it's beneficial for some of the areas that have come into town that don't have sidewalks, they don't have some of these other improvements, and they may never have them, and maybe that's a lesson learned, but the question is how much improvements should we require? But it all goes back again for me, kind of talking about the Metzger property. If we go the city-initiated route, I've got to see ironclad, this person was notified, guaranteed, and not, well, we sent a letter and we don't know if he ever got it.
Yeah, that's a very easy one to help improve on. I mean,
Yeah.
we were trying to follow state law, and we've heard the message that we need to go over and above that and put together a better line of communication and notification process. And that's an easy one that we can work on.
And can there, I mean, I don't know if there's some way in which maybe there's a process in which you can show that there was, some sort of the attempt of a negotiation and a pre-annexation, and then, these things failed, we're not getting anywhere, so now we're going to, decide when we have to drop the hammer, as it were.
Councilor Staley?
Well, and just piggybacking on what he said, if we were informed, for example, with that Metzger property, we got sworn in May, and the first time I heard about it was right before we were going to have the discussion with him. I didn't realize that this was even coming. And so I think it would be good for us to know as we're going along, so maybe we can even be talking to the homeowner. Why can't we be a part of the dialogue as well as the city?
Yep, and those are good comments. But again, I think we need to step back and say, what should the priorities be before we start approaching property owners? What should the criteria be for us to use and the council to use going forward? And that's what we want to work with you on.
Okay. Councilor Selberg, any other questions on your part? Then before I go to other councilors out in the audience, just a couple of comments of my own here. I think we are all in agreement, everybody, on both sides, all sides of this particular issue, that development of a sound communication plan is a must, something that we have to have. And regarding the decisions, what type of annexation process on your last slide, what type of annexation process is the city council willing to support? Petition, city initiated, or pre-annexation agreement? I mean, petitioned, that's kind of a given. If somebody wants to come in, I don't think we're going to say, no, we don't want you. So that's not an issue. I would like to think maybe if we could then move pre-annexation agreement somewhere up into that number 2 category, so that we're looking out into the future and we see this as a possibility. Yep. And this, and this needs to be done over this particular time period, and there's not going to be any surprises. The kicker is the city initiated, and I would agree. Councilor Neitzer had brought up one of the topics that I was going to bring up as well, and that's the septic tanks. Because if you've just replaced your septic tank and now you're annexed and you're told you can't use it anymore and you have to actually fill it in, which is an additional cost on top of the new cost, that is that does sting. That actually happened to one of my relatives, not here in the city, elsewhere. But so if we can set up a plan to work with that. Obviously, as Councilor Neitzer had mentioned, we would not permit them to replace the tank with another tank at that point in time. And I think we'd also have to put in some kind of language to that. We're assured that it's in proper operating condition too, so that we don't have any issues with that. And then my other question to you, I guess, is, you know, and this is probably going more along the line of the pre-annexation agreement. You know, what can we do in terms of incremental increases in taxes instead of all of a sudden I'm going from the township levy rate of taxation to the city rate, which can be a sizable amount, especially depending upon the size of the property. You know, what is the process of an incremental system in which I'm paying over a 5-year period in increments that brings us now up to that? And maybe you're already doing that with the pre-annexation agreements. Could you address that some?
You're talking property tax versus
Yes,
assessments.
yes.
Yeah, I think we would have to go back and look at what's the legal mechanism that could potentially allow us to do that,
Okay.
to do an incremental increase in property taxes. If we annex the land early in the year versus later in the year, it can trigger a whole nother year of delay before it does go on the tax rolls. But in terms of an incremental increase, I think that's something that we would have to do a little more research on if we have the legal ability to do anything like that.
Okay, great. Other counselors not on land use committee, is there anybody that has anything that they would like to add or any questions?
Or if they want to volunteer to help us.
Yes,
Okay.
it looks like you just got your first volunteer.
I don't know about that.
Counselor Erickson.
One of the things, I'm appreciative of this conversation that we've had today. I think that it's important and, you know, as simple as changing the way that we communicate, if it's a single annexation, I think is kind of a no-brainer, simple thing that we can do as we move forward. And obviously, Director Cooper had already made comments about doing that, and so I think that's important. I was just looking at the prioritization options, and as we look through some of those, we certainly want to be mindful of not slowing development as we annex. You know, oftentimes when we do annex a new area and rezone it, we are creating pockets, and that's not a good thing. But should we do it at the ability to not then develop because we are creating one pocket? Yeah, it's not a good thing to create that pocket, but we also, like I said, want to be mindful that we're not slowing the development if someone has an idea to do a new development or a different kind of commercial or whatever that those properties look like. The first thing on the prioritization options, it says the unannexed property is adjacent to a planned street or utility improvement. The only thing that I want to add to that is there has been instances where the streets already have been in. So that negotiation process really, in my opinion, maybe should have taken place prior to the street going in. We knew we were going to put the street in. We knew we were going to put some of that infrastructure in. So have that conversation. That should be at the very top of the prioritization. But also at the same time, there's oftentimes when annexations happen, some of these developments sit empty for 10 years. I mean, we saw in the instance of Canterbury Heights that has sat because of many different circumstances, but that development sat kind of slow for quite some time and has now started to see more development. So just because it's annexed and then rezoned, does that mean that you should automatically be triggered? I don't know if that's the right answer too. So just throwing some suggestions, hypotheticals out there that, you know, even if you're surrounded, it might not be that time. Is it a priority for houses? Is it a priority for commercial? I think those are things that we should continue the conversation, of course, and this is just the start of that, but communication is the first place to start, of course. So thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you, Counselor Erickson. Any other counselors? Welcome, Counselor Rolfing.
Thank you, Councilor Rex Rolfing. This may not be as popular as some people would like to have it, but I think we need to realize what's happened with many of these annexations. I look at the Prairie Meadows situation out there. I had a young man who played soccer with my son, whose parents moved in there probably in the early 70s, it would have been in the middle 80s, thinking that Sioux Falls was going to be 50 years from being out there, maybe even farther. And that's fine. One of the reasons they moved in there was because land prices were cheaper. was cheaper to live out there because you could have your own septic tank, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But they knew at that time that the city was going to surround them sometime, was going to grow out to them, and that they would need to be part of the city and want to be part of the city. So I think we need to look at this and be very cognizant, as Councilor Staley has said, of what the money is that it's going to cost to do this and help and do some things whenever we can. But we also need to realize that these people who bought those homes knew that someday this was going to happen. They had to know that. Sioux Falls is growing too fast for people not to know that. And so I know you were talking about an interest rate. I know we set the interest rate, Tracy, is at the seat of the government prime plus 1%, plus 2%. So, you know, the prime is like 1% now or less. And so we're charging them about the same as what we got the bonds issued for the new administration building, about 3%. Yeah, and we brought that down from 5%, which was where it was before. So it's we've done some of those things, but this is going to be a tough one. This is going to be a real tough one for everybody. But hopefully we can work this thing out and come to some resolution. And I applaud us for taking it on, and we will. And we'll come out with something that, you know, like they'll say, if you go away mad and the homeowners go away mad, we probably came together with a pretty good solution. So hopefully we can do that.
Hopefully it'll be, we all go away happy. We came up with a better solution. Okay, I think we need to start thinking a little bit, and maybe some discussion among the committee as to what we think we want to do with the next step. And I know that I have some thoughts in mind, but Councilor Neitzer, did you have something else to say, though?
If I just,
yes, go ahead.
Real quick, just to follow up. So I think it was a great idea. As you look at the CIP each year, maybe those, you know, if there's properties that are, if we have a new road or whatever that we're going to do, those properties maybe bubble up because we know in a couple of years that we're going to be doing a road project down there that we should get in discussions with that property owner. And then, as was mentioned, there's a lot of land that gets annexed. For example, out near where I live, there was a lot of land that was annexed near T. Ellis Road. And when I mean, it was annexed in like 2005, 2006, and then the market turned, and it sat there for a decade or more, and it's finally starting to develop. So I guess I'd be careful about using a trigger point that it's simply surrounded by annexed property if nobody's started turning any dirt, because there's no guarantees that it's going to happen anytime soon because of markets and other factors. And then the last thing is we just have to be thinking about, I guess, again, the incremental cost. I have to think that for some people, when you're talking a $60,000 bill on a $150,000 or $200,000 house, that's going to be devastating for some people, and we have to be sensitive to that. So anything that we can do to help that, I guess I'd be open to input on where we go from this.
One initial thought that I had, and please, other committee members offer any thoughts that you have too, is that as a committee, we request other counselors to feed us information that they would like us to pursue. Public, especially members that are potentially subject to annexations, feed us, counselors, committee, or otherwise, information as to how you think you're impacted and suggestions. And then we as a committee can continue to work with Director Cooper and his team, and we don't even have to really wait for the next land use committee next month. We could be doing some of these things behind the scene, and then we could convene another we could entertain this topic again at another land use committee. But those are just my thoughts. Any other committee member have additional thoughts? Councilor Staley.
Well, and this is going back to just our basic discussion. And Director Cooper, you were here presenting this a few months ago. I suggested then that we design a program similar to what we do with community development, where we would assist homeowners who are going to be afflicted with a great hardship financially. So example of Prairie Meadows, and maybe I know there's some retired people there on fixed incomes, so that we would have something in place that as this thing moves forward, they would be able to get some assistance from our city. That's going to make me feel better about moving forward on this. And thank you, Councilor Erickson, for talking about development-driven triggers, that we can't have a one-size-fits-all on this moving forward either. Thank you.
Councilor Neitzer.
Just to follow up on what you said, I think, you know, as I look at these slides, there's some major items that I think just sitting down and just drilling down into just major topic areas in between now and the next land use meeting, because there's some things that we could spend an hour on just drilling down into, you know, having that discussion. For example, maybe having one discussion about what are the minimum improvements and talking, and we can see what are our choices: sidewalks, you know, roads, curbs and gutters, and looking at the implications of those, and then we can bring that back and continue the discussion.
Sure. And even that, we know that's difficult because each particular area has its own characteristics and may need to be treated differently. And because I know that in my particular district of the city, I have dealt with an area, and I won't name any names or anything, but an area that's been annexed and no curb and gutter. But we've been dealing with a sightline issue that has resulted from some of that. Our streets are narrower than what they normally are. We've got a corner that's quite blind, and especially in the spring, summer, and fall of the year, when with the foliage and leaves on the trees, it's near impossible to see around until you're out into the intersection. So there's going to be a lot of unique characteristics such as that we'll actually have to consider going forward. Director Cooper.
I was just going to say that we'll continue to work with our team, Public Works, Finance, attorneys, to follow up on some of the questions, suggestions that have come from you today. And we're very, very interested to continue this discussion moving forward. And we're not going to get everything done in 30 days, but at least if we have a path that we're heading down that's going to be clearer than the one we have right now, that would be great for everybody.
It would be just great to get a plan so that we come up with a plan so that we eliminate the continuation of additional pockets taking place. And I know that we have to identify at some point in time, we have to initiate something. And so that means that somebody might be treated differently than, well, I wasn't annexed for 10, 20 years. Now I'm annexed within a 5-year period of time. That's probably the way it's going to have to work out in some cases. But
and then ultimately, depending on what we come up with, we can do a better job of communicating to property owners what is the expectations. What are they going to be in terms of timing and level of impact? So that'll be great.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Okay, well, that brings us to open discussion. Any items for open discussion, committee? Seeing none, this meeting is adjourned.